On October 4, 1957, a polished aluminum sphere no larger than a beach ball crossed the threshold of Earth's atmosphere and began circling the planet at 18,000 miles per hour, emitting a steady pulse that could be picked up by any amateur radio operator on the ground. That sphere, Sputnik, was built in a classified facility on the outskirts of Moscow under the direction of a man the Soviet government refused to name publicly, a figure known only as the chief designer. How did a nation devastated by the deadliest war in human history, a country that had lost 27 million of its people barely a decade earlier, manage to beat the wealthiest and most technologically advanced superpower on Earth into the cosmos? The answer to that question is not simple, and it is not the story most people think they know. It is not merely a tale of rockets and physics. It is a story of obsession, of political maneuvering, of prison camps and second chances, of a rivalry between two men on opposite sides of the world who never met, and of a system that, for all its brutality, managed to channel human ambition toward an almost impossible goal. To understand how the Soviet Union reached space first, you have to go back not to the 1950s but to the 1930s, to a freezing prison workshop where a man with broken bones in his jaw sat drafting rocket engines under the supervision of armed guards. His name was Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. Born in 1907 in Zhytomyr, in what is now Ukraine, Korolev became fascinated with flight as a teenager. By his mid-20s, he was one of the Soviet Union's most promising rocket engineers, co-founding the Group for the Study of Reactive Motion, known by its Russian acronym GERD, in 1931. GERD launched the Soviet Union's first liquid-fueled rocket in 1933. Korolev was brilliant, driven, and politically naive. In 1938, at the height of Stalin's Great Purge, he was arrested on fabricated charges of sabotage and treason. He was beaten during interrogation so severely that his jaw was broken and never healed properly. He was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor and sent to Kolyma, one of the most lethal labor camps in the Gulag system, where temperatures could drop to -50 degrees Celsius, and prisoners died by the thousands from exhaustion, scurvy, and cold. Had it not been for the intervention of aircraft designer Andrei Tupolev, himself a prisoner, Korolev would almost certainly have died there. Tupolev requested Korolev's transfer to a Sharashka, a special prison laboratory where imprisoned scientists and engineers were forced to work on military projects. Korolev survived, but the experience marked him for life. The man who would one day be responsible for the greatest technological triumph of the 20th century carried the Gulag in his body, in his damaged heart, in his jaw that clicked when he spoke. After the war ended in 1945, the Soviet Union and the United States both scrambled to seize German rocket technology and the scientists who had built it. The prize was the V-2, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, developed at Peenemünde under the direction of Wernher von Braun. The Americans moved faster. Operation Paperclip brought von Braun and more than 100 of his top engineers to the United States. The Soviets arrived at the V-2 production facilities second and found the shelves mostly bare. They captured some lower-ranking German engineers and a significant quantity of V-2 components, but they did not get von Braun, and they did not get the full technical documentation. What they did have was Korolev, now released from prison and burning with a quiet, relentless intensity. He was given the task of reverse engineering the V-2 and then surpassing it. Most Western analysts at the time assumed the Soviets would lag behind for years, perhaps decades. They were wrong, and the reason they were wrong reveals something essential about the nature of innovation under pressure. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this, to the hidden mechanics behind the events that shaped the 20th century, consider subscribing to this channel. We dig into the archives, the declassified files, and the overlooked details of Soviet and Cold War history to bring you the full picture, not just the headline. One click, and you will not miss what comes next. Korolev understood something that his American counterpart von Braun also understood, but could not always act on, that a rocket is only as good as the system that supports it. In the Soviet Union, despite the chaos and the terror, the system was in some ways uniquely suited to the task. The centralized command economy meant that Korolev, once he had political backing, could requisition materials, personnel, and facilities with an authority that a private contractor in the United States could only dream of. There were no congressional hearings, no competing corporate interests, no public budget debates. There was the state, and the state wanted missiles. The distinction between a ballistic missile and a space launch vehicle, it turned out, was mostly a matter of ambition and payload. Korolev grasped this early, and he began to think beyond weapons almost from the start. But let us not romanticize the Soviet system, because the same centralization that empowered Korolev also nearly destroyed the entire program multiple times. The Soviet rocket effort was riddled with bureaucratic rivalries that could turn lethal. Korolev's chief rival was Valentin Glushko, a brilliant engine designer who had also survived the Gulag. The two men despised each other. Glushko had reportedly given testimony against Korolev during the purges, a fact that Korolev never forgave. Their technical disagreements, particularly over propellant choices, would eventually fracture the Soviet space program at its most critical moment. But, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, their competition was still productive. Glushko designed engines. Korolev designed the rockets that carried them. Together, sometimes without speaking to each other, they built the foundation of Soviet rocketry. By 1953, Stalin was dead, and the political landscape shifted in ways that would prove decisive for the space program. Nikita Khrushchev, who consolidated power by 1955, was a man who understood the propaganda value of technology far better than Stalin ever had. Khrushchev did not particularly care about space for its own sake. What he cared about was demonstrating to the world, and especially to the United States, that the Soviet system was superior. A rocket that could reach orbit was a rocket that could reach New York. The strategic logic was inseparable from the spectacle. When Korolev proposed using his new R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile to launch an artificial satellite into orbit, Khrushchev initially showed limited enthusiasm. The R-7 was being developed primarily as a weapon designed to carry a thermonuclear warhead across intercontinental distances. But Korolev was persistent, and he was persuasive. He argued that a satellite launch would be a relatively inexpensive addition to the missile program and would yield enormous political dividends. Khrushchev gave cautious approval, but he did not prioritize it. The satellite was, at first, almost an afterthought. Here is where the story takes an ironic turn that most accounts understate. The United States was also planning to launch a satellite. The program was called Vanguard, and it was run by the Naval Research Laboratory. The Americans had announced their intention publicly as part of the International Geophysical Year, a coordinated global scientific effort running from July 1957 to December 1958. The announcement was meant to signal openness and scientific leadership. Instead, it gave Korolev a deadline and a target. He knew exactly what the Americans were planning, roughly when they intended to launch, and he was determined to beat them. The Soviets, characteristically, said nothing publicly. They worked in silence. The R-7, designated the Semyorka, was an engineering marvel born of constraint. The Soviet Union did not yet have the ability to miniaturize nuclear warheads to the degree the Americans had achieved, so the R-7 had to be enormous, capable of carrying a warhead weighing several tons. This apparent disadvantage became the program's greatest asset. Because the R-7 was so powerful, it had far more lifting capacity than any American rocket of the era. It could put a satellite into orbit with thrust to spare. The rocket stood over 30 meters tall, with a distinctive cluster of 4 strap-on boosters surrounding a central core, all firing at liftoff. Its 20 engines, designed by Glushko, generated a combined thrust of nearly 400 tons. Testing began at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, a remote launch facility in the Kazakh steppe, in May 1957. The first test flight failed. The second failed. Korolev's team was exhausted. The pressure from Moscow was constant. On the third attempt on August 21, 1957, the R-7 flew successfully for the first time, traveling over 6,000 kilometers and impacting in the Kamchatka Peninsula. The weapon worked. Now Korolev could pivot to the satellite. The original satellite design had been elaborate, packed with scientific instruments, but delays and technical complications threatened to push the launch date past the American Vanguard schedule. Korolev made a fateful decision. He scrapped the complex satellite and ordered the construction of a simple, small, polished sphere that would do nothing more than orbit and transmit a radio signal. It would be called Prostayshi Sputnik, the simplest satellite, abbreviated to PS-1, and known to the world simply as Sputnik. The entire satellite weighed just 83.6 kilograms. It was assembled in weeks. The simplicity was strategic. Korolev did not need to impress scientists. He needed to get there first. On the evening of October 4, 1957, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, the temperature was dropping toward freezing. The R-7, loaded with its tiny payload, stood illuminated by floodlights on the launch pad. Korolev was in the command bunker, chain-smoking, his damaged jaw clenched. He had survived the Gulag, survived the purges, survived years of bureaucratic warfare. Everything he had worked for came down to this moment. At 10:28 p.m. Moscow time, the engines ignited. The rocket rose. The boosters separated cleanly. The core stage performed as designed. Approximately 5 minutes after liftoff, Sputnik separated from the upper stage and entered orbit roughly 900 kilometers above the Earth at its highest point. The telemetry station picked up the signal, a steady beep repeating every 0.3 of a second. It was the most consequential sound in the history of technology. The reaction in the United States was immediate and seismic. President Eisenhower initially tried to downplay the achievement, calling Sputnik a small ball in the air. He was wrong, and he knew it almost immediately. The American public panicked. Newspapers ran headlines about Soviet superiority. Lyndon Johnson, then Senate Majority Leader, declared that the Romans had controlled the world because they could build roads, and the British had controlled the world because they had ships, and the Americans had better not fall behind in the contest for space. The strategic implications were unmistakable. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead on any city in the world. The Sputnik crisis, as it came to be known, triggered a complete reorganization of American science and defense policy. Within a year, the United States created NASA, passed the National Defense Education Act to pour funding into science and engineering education, and dramatically accelerated its own missile and space programs. The entire architecture of the modern American research university system, with its federal grants and its emphasis on STEM fields, can be traced in significant part to the shock of October 1957. But Korolev was not finished. He understood that one satellite was a stunt, two would be a pattern. Less than a month later, on November 3, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, and this time the payload was not a metal sphere but a living creature. Laika, a stray dog pulled from the streets of Moscow, became the first animal to orbit the Earth. The mission was hastily planned, ordered directly by Khrushchev, who wanted another triumph in time for the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. There was no plan to bring Laika back alive. The technology for orbital re-entry did not yet exist. Laika died within hours of reaching orbit, likely from overheating and stress, though Soviet authorities claimed for decades that she had survived for several days. The mission was a propaganda triumph and a scientific tragedy, and it foreshadowed the tension that would define the entire Soviet space program, the gap between what the leadership demanded and what the engineers could safely deliver. Meanwhile, the American Vanguard program suffered a humiliation that deepened the crisis. On December 6, 1957, 2 months after Sputnik, the Vanguard TV-3 rocket rose approximately 1 meter off the launch pad, lost thrust, collapsed back onto the pad, and exploded in a fireball broadcast live on national television. The press called it Flopnik, Kaputnik, Staputnik. The failure was not just technical, it was symbolic. The United States, the supposed leader of the free world, could not get a grapefruit-sized satellite off the ground while the Soviets were already orbiting dogs. It was Wernher von Braun, the former Nazi engineer now working for the US Army, who salvaged American pride. On January 31, 1958, his Jupiter C rocket successfully launched Explorer 1, the first American satellite. But by then, the Soviets were already planning something far more ambitious. What Korolev wanted, what he had always wanted, was to send a human being into space. And the Soviet leadership, intoxicated by the political returns of Sputnik, was ready to let him try. The Vostok program began in earnest in 1959. The challenges were staggering. No one knew if a human body could survive the sustained weightlessness of orbit, the psychological isolation, the forces of re-entry. The spacecraft had to be designed to protect a single cosmonaut through launch, orbit, and return. Korolev's solution was characteristically pragmatic. The Vostok capsule was a sphere, the shape that distributes re-entry heating most evenly, attached to an instrument module that would be jettisoned before re-entry. The cosmonaut would eject from the capsule during descent and parachute to the ground separately, because the capsule's own parachute system could not guarantee a survivable landing speed. This detail was kept secret for years because the international rules for aviation records required the pilot to land inside the craft. The Soviets lied about it until 1971. The selection of cosmonauts began in 1960. 20 young military pilots were chosen, all short in stature because the Vostok capsule was tiny, all from working class or peasant backgrounds because Khrushchev wanted the first man in space to be a symbol of Soviet egalitarianism. Among them was Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin, born in 1934 in the village of Klushino, west of Moscow. Gagarin was the son of a carpenter and a dairy worker. During the German occupation, his family had been evicted from their home, and two of his siblings had been deported to Germany as forced laborers. He was charming, disciplined, and possessed a smile that would become one of the most recognizable images of the 20th century. He was also, by all accounts, genuinely brave. There is a detail from the cosmonaut training program that captures the atmosphere of the era. The candidates were subjected to isolation chamber tests, locked alone in soundproof rooms for days at a time to assess their psychological resilience. Several candidates broke. Gagarin reportedly remained calm, humming songs and talking to himself in a measured voice. When asked by the selection committee why he wanted to fly in space, he did not give a grandiose answer about the glory of the Soviet state. He said he wanted to see what was up there. The committee chose him, but the path to April 12, 1961 was not smooth. Unmanned test flights of the Vostok spacecraft experienced serious failures. In one test, the instrument module failed to separate cleanly from the capsule, sending it tumbling during re-entry. In another, the capsule overshot its landing zone by hundreds of kilometers. A test flight carrying two dogs and a mannequin dressed in a spacesuit succeeded in March 1961, and Korolev declared the system ready. Many of his engineers disagreed. The reliability numbers were far below what most safety standards would accept, but Korolev had intelligence that the Americans were close. The Mercury program run by NASA was preparing its own crewed flight. Alan Shepard was in training. The window was narrow. Korolev pushed forward. On the morning of April 12, 1961, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, the air was cold and clear. Gagarin rode a bus to the launch pad, wearing an orange pressure suit with the letters CCCP painted on his helmet in red, added at the last minute so that Soviet citizens who saw him land would not mistake him for a foreign spy. At 9:07 a.m. Moscow time, the R-7 rocket, now in its Vostok configuration, ignited. Gagarin reportedly said, "Poyakali, let's go," a phrase that entered the Russian language as a permanent expression of boldness. The rocket climbed. Gagarin entered orbit. For 108 minutes, he circled the Earth at an altitude of over 300 kilometers, traveling at nearly 28,000 kilometers per hour. He was the first human being to see the planet from space. He reported that the Earth was blue, that the horizon was beautiful, that the transition from light to dark was sharp and sudden. He also reported that the weightlessness was pleasant. The re-entry was harrowing. The instrument module did not separate cleanly, just as it had failed in unmanned tests. The capsule tumbled violently for 10 minutes as the connecting cables slowly burned away from the heat of re-entry. Gagarin endured forces of 8 Gs. The capsule finally stabilized, the parachute deployed, and at an altitude of 7 kilometers, Gagarin ejected and parachuted to the ground near the village of Smelovka, in the Saratov region. He landed in a field. A farmer and her granddaughter were the first to see him. He was alive. The Soviet Union had won. The global impact was overwhelming. Khrushchev declared a national holiday. Gagarin was paraded through Moscow before millions. The achievement was broadcast worldwide. In the United States, President Kennedy was privately furious. His science advisors told him bluntly that the Soviets were ahead and would likely remain ahead in the short term. On May 25, 1961, just 6 weeks after Gagarin's flight, Kennedy stood before Congress and committed the United States to landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade. The Apollo program was born directly from the wound of Gagarin's triumph. Without Vostok, there would have been no moonwalk. But here is the part of the story that rarely gets told in the triumphant version. The Soviet victory in the space race was not the product of a superior system. It was the product of a specific set of circumstances that would prove impossible to sustain. Korolev was the linchpin. He held the entire program together through force of will, political savvy, and technical genius. He managed Khrushchev's expectations, navigated the bureaucratic rivalries, and made critical engineering decisions under impossible pressure. But the system did not reward sustainability. It rewarded spectacle. Each success raised the bar. Each triumph required a greater one to follow. Khrushchev demanded more firsts: the first woman in space, the first multi-person crew, the first spacewalk. Korolev delivered all of them, often by cutting corners that terrified his own engineers. The first spacewalk, performed by Alexei Leonov on March 18, 1965, nearly ended in disaster. Leonov's spacesuit ballooned in the vacuum, and he could not fit back through the airlock. He was forced to bleed off pressure from his suit, risking decompression sickness, and squeeze back inside in a state of near panic. The Voskhod spacecraft that carried him was a modified Vostok, crammed with extra seats to beat the American Gemini program's multi-crew flights. It was so tightly packed that the cosmonauts could not wear pressure suits during launch or re-entry. If the cabin had depressurized, they would have died. Korolev knew this. He accepted the risk because the alternative was losing the narrative. And then, on January 14, 1966, Sergei Korolev died on an operating table in Moscow. He was 59 years old. He had gone in for what was supposed to be routine surgery to remove a polyp from his intestine. The surgeons discovered a large tumor and attempted to remove it. Korolev's weakened body, ravaged by years in the Gulag, could not endure the procedure. His heart stopped. Only after his death did the Soviet government reveal his identity. For his entire career, he had been known publicly only as the anonymous chief designer. His obituary in Pravda was the first time most Soviet citizens learned his name. His death exposed the fragility of the entire program. There was no succession plan. The rivalries he had suppressed erupted immediately. Glushko and other designers jockeyed for control. The Soviet lunar program, already behind schedule, fragmented into competing fiefdoms. The N-1 rocket, the Soviet answer to the Saturn V, was tested 4 times between 1969 and 1972. All 4 tests failed. The second test, on July 3, 1969, resulted in one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history, when the rocket fell back onto the launch pad and detonated, destroying the pad and scattering debris across the cosmodrome. The Soviets never reached the moon. The Americans did, of course. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. The achievement was monumental, and it was made possible in part by the very shock that Sputnik had delivered 12 years earlier. The entire trajectory of Apollo, from its funding to its urgency to its engineering philosophy, was a response to the Soviet firsts that Korolev had orchestrated. In a strange and deeply ironic sense, the man most responsible for putting Americans on the moon was a Soviet engineer who died 3 years before it happened. What the Soviet space program's early triumphs reveal is something uncomfortable about the relationship between systems of governance and innovation. The Soviet Union's centralization, its ability to marshal resources without democratic debate, its willingness to accept risks that no open society would tolerate, gave it a decisive advantage in the short term. It could move faster, keep secrets longer, and push human beings further than a system built on transparency and consent. But that same centralization made the program dependent on individuals rather than institutions. When Korolev died, the program died with him, not immediately but inevitably. The United States, by contrast, built NASA as an institution with layers of redundancy, documentation, and process that survived the departure of any single individual. The tortoise caught the hare. There is one more detail worth holding on to. In the years after the space race, Soviet cosmonauts and American astronauts began meeting at international conferences. They discovered almost universally that they liked each other. They shared the same obsession, the same willingness to sit on top of controlled explosions for the chance to see the Earth from above. Gagarin and the Mercury astronauts never met formally, but those who knew them said they would have gotten along instantly. Gagarin died in a training jet crash in 1968 at the age of 34. Von Braun died of cancer in 1977. The rockets they built are museum pieces now. But the question their lives posed remains alive. What happens when the drive to be first overrides every other consideration? And what is the cost of winning a race that never really ends? The beep of Sputnik faded from the airwaves decades ago, but its echo still shapes the world we live in, from the satellites that guide our phones to the geopolitical anxieties that govern our headlines. The Cold War is over. The competition for the heavens is not.